Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Reading the Room, a podcast in which I am joined by a bookish guest to talk about something bookish. And today I am so excited to be joined by Antonia Angress, who is the author of the debut novel Sirens and Muses, which I absolutely devoured and I love it so much. And I've been so excited to talk to you. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Can you give us a brief synopsis of this book? There's a lot going on in it, lots of characters, and so I'm curious to see your elevator pitch for it.
Sure. So it's I suppose, in part a campus novel that follows four striving, struggling artists, three students and one visiting professor. First at an art college in New England and later on in New York City, against the backdrop of the Occupy movement. So the novel takes place about a decade ago during the recession. So it's, like I said, it's a campus novel, but it's also just a coming of age story about art and love and politics, and creativity and capitalism and making meaning. And I should also add that, I'm making it sound quite serious, but I do think I've been hearing from readers that it's a funny book, or at least it has funny moments. It's also a love story. I've been hearing from a lot of readers who've really connected with that aspect of it. And it's a queer love story too, I should say. I think of it very much as like a bisexual novel.
You're right. I think there's a lot of humor in this book, particularly for me with like the Preston and Robert situation, that dynamic, how it plays out. And we'll get into that. I guess before we jump into the meat of the novel, it's my understanding that this book took you 7 years to write. Is that correct?
Yes, it did. It took me most of my 20s to write.
That must be so exciting to, hold the final product. But I'm wondering, what was like the most fun and also like the most challenging aspects of writing this book?
So for me, the fun part of writing is whenever I've gotten past the, sort of the agonizing first draft stage, and I have a really firm idea in mind of what the shape of the book is going to be, and I'm sort of helping it, pushing it towards that, that ideal. And like, not to sound like too woo woo, but I think there's a point in which like the story tells me what it wants to be, and it's sort of my job to help shepherd it to that point. That's a point in the drafting process that is really, really hard to get to. I struggled for a few years just finishing a first draft. And I think like the most challenging part was probably figuring out how these four storylines fit together. So it's a novel that's told from four POVs. The storylines diverge and then recross again. And because I was dealing with like four different storylines, I had to do a lot of experimenting to figure out what worked and what didn't, and like what thematic echoes were too on the nose, and what storyline convergences were too convenient. At one point I had an Excel spreadsheet with with all the different storylines, and I kind of set myself a really difficult task for my first book. If I were giving advice to emerging novelists, I would say maybe don't do four POVs for your first novel. Because it was hard. It took me a long time to figure out, and I think partly for that reason my next book is going to be just one POV, first person, because I'm tired.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about how it's four POVs and third person. I mean, I know you're writing it now, but do you have one that you kind of prefer in terms of craft for like your own writing, I guess?
So I've always really sort of written in close third person, which is what this novel is, where you're in the character's head and you're seeing the world through their eyes, but there is sort of like a little bit of narrative distance. I've found that worked really well for this novel in particular because I was sort of inhabiting these four very, very, very different characters. Having that sort of close third person gave me a way to sort of inhabit them, but to also have like a bit of distance in order to kind of I guess what I'm saying is I think it would have been very, very difficult to distinguish the voices in first person, and third person gave me a little bit more flexibility in terms of like jumping in and out of the characters. I've never, so like I said, my next novel is going to be in first person, and that's not really a mode that I'm really used to writing in. So that's kind of been a learning curve for me, like learning to sort of channel a character in first person. And it's interesting to me because I've spoken to a lot of writers who sort of have like a default. They'll only write in first person or they'll only write in third, and they have like very particular preferences. And I think my preference, over the course of my writing life has definitely been third person. So first person is kind of like this little challenge to myself to see if I can pull it off.
Yeah, that'll be really exciting to see. I'm so excited for your next book, so I will be reading it as soon as it comes out.
Oh, thank you. It's going to be a while.
Yeah. Well, I mean, on that point, I guess a question for you is, in terms of like the setting of this book and how it's set in 2011 around Occupy Wall Street, how did you come to that as the setting for the novel?
Well, part of it was just convenient for me in the sense that that was the time when I was in college. So I'm 31. I graduated from college in 2013, so kind of on the tail end of the recession. And when I decided that I wanted to write a campus novel, I decided to set it in the time period when I was a college student, because that meant that, I knew the cultural touchstones. I knew what it was like to be a college student at that time. I've been getting this question a lot, and my answer is always like, I don't know what it's like to be a college student now. Like, I have no idea what it must have been like to go through like the pandemic as a college student. Everyone's on TikTok now. Like, social media was not as big of a thing when I was in college. And the novel, kind of explores that. So that's one reason, that it was just easier for me to write about characters who were, in their early 20s at a time when I was in my early 20s. And I think that, the second reason is that the Occupy movement for me was sort of my first encounter with American, like, political movements, or American, like, sort of protest movements. I should say that I grew up abroad. I'm the child of two American expats. I was raised in Costa Rica, so I'm sort of like a third culture kid, I guess, is the term. So when I went to college, I was American. I held an American passport, but it was sort of my first time really experiencing American political culture. And, if you were young then, it felt sort of all encompassing. It felt like, oh, this is the moment when things are going to change. And the movement sort of expressed a lot of the anxieties that I was feeling and that my friends were feeling at the time, sort of coming of age into, this completely deflated economy, and this feeling that like the future had been pulled out from under us. So that was sort of a feeling that I wanted to capture, and also kind of like, I don't know, a naivete, I think, during the Obama years, this feeling of like despair because of the recession, but also sort of hopefulness because, we had this, very inspiring and charismatic president at the time. Of course, then everything changed. And again, I can't imagine what it must have been like to be on a college campus under the Trump administration, for example. I think my generation was perhaps more politically complacent because we came of age, this sort of hopeful time in the progressive movement.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting to think about that setting for this novel, because one thing that it's really preoccupied with is this idea of art as being simultaneously like this personal and very intimate thing while also being political, and how art can play through a political lens. And so one of the characters, Robert, he talks about one of his paintings that received a lot of acclaim of his friend. In the book, it says, the truth he was beginning to realize now that he was solidly in his late middle age was that he'd become a political painter only because he'd made a personal painting that other people had politicized. And I thought that would be a fun entry point to talk about art and politics in this novel, and how you sort of broach that subject in a novel form.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good question. Like the question of how, what the connection is between art and politics. And I think the answer is really complicated. Like, obviously art can influence politics. And there's a reason that the art of AIDS activism, which I reference in the book, and which, Robert had, a small role in. There's a reason that art is so iconic, right? It was hugely impactful. When you think of like the pink triangle, silence equals death, that was part of the art that came out of the AIDS crisis. And, there's a reason it's iconic today. It had a huge impact on the culture. And, when you think of, for example, photography, there are so many iconic photos that we can refer to that shifted public consciousness around an issue. So like from the Vietnam War to the Iraq War. And I think we sort of see it now, like in certain ways. Like, I think of like the pink pussy hat as as sort of this artistic reaction to Trump. And then, the Obama Hope poster by Shepard Fairey, which I also reference in the book, that's sort of, become this iconic image of a political movement. The question that I sort of explore in the book, and the question that, sort of emerges over the course of the novel, is like, does political art actually spur change, like directly? And I think this is something the characters struggle with, because I don't know that it necessarily does, right? Like, direct action spurs change. Grassroots organizing spurs change. So that's a question that the characters wrestle with in the book, but I think I've wrestled with it personally too, right? Like, I spent 7 years working on a book, largely in solitude. And I often sort of ask myself, like, who does this help? What good is this doing in the world? What is the role of art in moments of crisis? And I think that's a question that lots of my characters, notably Robert, as you mentioned, really wrestle with, especially when the painting in question was not really a political statement. It was sort of, this both an act of love and an act of like profound creative selfishness. And I'm interested in how those two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
I think you explore that so well in this novel, and I really love those ideas. I guess starting from the sort of rivalry, I guess, between Preston and Robert. And there's this one point in the novel where Robert's thinking about art as like approximation, and he's wondering whether, I think the quote is, what if the truth was that art would always fail because it could only ever be an approximation of something else, that it wasn't the same as activism, just as opinion wasn't the same as politics, and a picture wasn't the same as an experience. And I loved that idea and sentiment, and thinking about how he's sort of reacting to Preston's ideas about Robert. And I guess from there I wanted to ask about your creation of Preston, because he's a character that I am really fascinated by, and he was really interesting to explore. The reader's opinion, at least my opinion of him, shifts a lot throughout the narrative when we learn more about him and his sort of complicated relationship with Karina and Robert and his family, and thinking about his own ambition, trying to seek virality on the internet through his art, and how all that plays out for him. So he's a very singular being in this novel. So how do you go about creating Preston?
I started out with the idea that I wanted to have like what various readers have called an art bro in my novel. he's not an art bro. Is not the art bro is like not really a figure that like you see that much in depictions of like fictional depictions of artists. Like oftentimes they're like they're mercurial geniuses, or they're like sensitive souls. I'm thinking of just depictions of art of male artists in particular, but you don't see the art bro very much, and he definitely exists. I've encountered many of them in my life, so that's kind of how I started out with him. But at the same time, I didn't want him to be a caricature. I didn't want him to be a villain, even though I think he's like, I don't think this novel has any villains, but I think he probably comes closest. I was really interested in how sort of toxic masculinity and this like sort of firmly ironic stance that he often takes kind of intersects with art and creation, which is, I think, fundamentally like a really vulnerable act. And I wanted the reader to, certainly he's quite despicable at times, and he does, really horrible things. He's got a misogynistic streak, but I also like, I spent 7 years with him, so I have a lot of empathy for him. I think he's like he's a really wounded person in living in a world that does not really allow men to express their woundedness. And I sometimes I think about like, what kind of artist is this person going to be in the future? Like, he's 22 in the novel. What's he going to be like at 40? And I do hope that he, will have found a more, sincere and emotive mode for his work as he gets older, because I think he's just he's someone who has repressed a lot of pain and a lot of trauma, and has sort of channeled it into this like kind of trollish art that seeks to like poke people in the face and like antagonize them instead of like engaging them emotionally.
I think the empathy really comes through in the book, because I also, while you're right, I think he's probably the closest to being a villain in my eyes. He's very complex, I would say, and I do feel empathy for him as well, even from my experience reading the book too. And it's interesting how Robert plays as a foil to him as an older artist, and thinking about their dynamic on that front. But I guess going into the other two characters in this novel, Karina is seeing Preston, and she's also has a very intense relationship with Louisa, who is her roommate at college. And so I'm wondering, in terms of Louisa and Karina and building their romance in this book, how did you go about doing that? And I think, just an additional point, it's really, I don't read a lot of like traditional romance books, but I do think they have quite like what they call an enemies to lovers dynamic, which is really fun to read. So I'm just curious how you went about crafting that.
That's funny. And I have had people call the novel a romance, which I don't really think it is, though it certainly has, the love story plays a pretty big role. And I'm a sucker for love stories too. So I had to put that in there. So I think, with Karina in particular, one of the things that I wanted to capture is that, at least in my experience, I'm a bisexual woman. And in my experience, being attracted to a man and being attracted to a woman are different. They feel different. And I think when you're bisexual and when you're in a relationship with a man, which I am, by the way, I married my college boyfriend, who is, also like the main artist in my life. But anyway, when you're a bisexual woman and you're in a relationship with a man, it's sort of easy to follow this script, right? Like we know what a hetero relationship is like supposed to look like because there are all these depictions of straight relationships in the media. It's sort of very easy to fall into this role that society has kind of erected for you as a woman, even if it's not necessarily what you want. And I think that's what Karina struggles with in the novel, where she sort of falls into this role with Preston, and sometimes it's quite pleasurable for her, but she also feels quite constricted by it. I think when two women are in a relationship together, conversely, there's sort of less of this prescribed narrative, or maybe the narrative has just not been sort of engraved into our collective consciousness to so deeply as straight narratives. So I think there's more freedom there, but there's also a lot more negotiation of power dynamics, which I wanted to depict between Louisa and Karina. The power dynamics between them shift a lot over the course of the novel. And that sort of plays into, I think, a little bit of what I wanted to explore in terms of like the male gaze and the female gaze, which again sort of goes back to what I was saying about prescribed narratives, right? There's this way in which the male gaze is sort of engraved into your consciousness. When you move through the world as a woman, right? When you're raised in a female body, there's this quote that I think describes it really well by John Berger, who's an art critic and a novelist. Men look at women, women watch themselves being looked at. And I think there are many moments in the novel when Karina and Louisa, to a lesser extent, I think, when they both experience themselves through a man's gaze. And that can be both really pleasurable when it's, sort of this consensual objectification, I guess you would call it, but it can also be like really, really constricting. But the female gaze, I think, which is what sort of part of the dynamic that I wrote between Louisa and Karina, I think that there is, because it's sort of untethered from that straight men look at women narrative, there's more freedom in it. It sort of takes for granted the woman's agency. And it's sort of an alternative to these narratives that we've been fed. And, to be clear, I don't want to sort of oversimplify and say like, oh, the male gaze is bad and the female gaze is good. I wanted to explore the experiences that I've had with certain women where I look at them and I'm attracted to them, but there's also like a kind of rivalry or jealousy or competition mixed into my attraction. I feel like it's sort of like this cliche at this point, like, do I want her or do I want to be her? But that's the dynamic that often is happening between Louisa and Karina. I think it's this dynamic that's sort of embedded in the queer female gaze that can be, I think, as fraught as it is pleasurable. And it's what this dynamic that I wanted to explore and in contrast with the male gaze in the novel.
I think it's interesting thinking about how their romance sort of blossoms over the course of the novel and the impetus of it. So they start as roommates and they're kind of curious about each other. But then eventually Louisa asks Karina to sit for her for a painting, and how the creation of art furthers the romance through the book. And at one point Karina's speaking with Louisa and she's talking about art generally, and she says it can make people feel the way you want them to feel. Art is the ultimate seduction. When I was thinking about that in terms of the intimacy between the characters and how art is so inherent to their relationships and to the novel itself, also thinking about how, going back to what you were saying about how it being at once a political practice, but also something that can be deeply interior and personal to the characters here. I think that sort of contrast between the dynamic between Preston and Robert versus Louisa and Karina and their creation of their art in a different manner, I guess, or a different style, is kind of interesting now that I'm thinking about it through how their relationship sort of formed throughout the novel. This idea of art as seduction, how did you explore that through their relationship?
Well, their relationship is very much one of, I suppose you could call it like the relationship between an artist and a muse, because Louisa paints Karina. She uses her in this series of paintings over the course of the book. But I think it's also a collaborative relationship ultimately. And I think the novel is really interested in this idea of creative collaboration, like what it means to use someone in your art, sometimes with their consent, sometimes without their consent, when it's with their consent, as as it is when Louisa is using Karina as this model for her series of paintings, how much authorship can be ascribed to the muse, to the person who's sort of inspiring this work, instrumental to the work, and how much of the art's impact can you attribute to the collaboration versus like the idea of like the singular genius.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about that question, not really from a painting perspective, again going back to novels, I guess, but like I've been asking a lot in my interviews about this question of like the morality of using real life people in work. Or I read a lot of autofiction, so I love thinking about these ideas of when you put something in like the fictional context, what does that give you room to do versus not do? What are the bounds for themselves that they want to set in that aspect? So I'm curious to know what you think about like autofiction generally, and this idea of using truth within fiction to explore these greater themes. It's a very broad question, so I apologize. But
no, and I'm really interested in that question too. And they're both this trope and also like this source of like scandals in the literary world, like the bad art friend thing and the cat person thing, where like the story cat person turned out to have been inspired by this real person who recognized herself in the story. And then like there recent novels that I've read that sort of take up that trope too. Like there's a novel that came out earlier this year called Last Resort. The Plot is book. Another one. Yeah, both really, really, really interesting books about like what are the ethics of taking from life, taking from other people, putting them in your work. Because I'm a writer, I am of the mind that everything kind of comes from life and everything is kind of fair game. You should not trust writers, I guess is what I'm saying. But I'm interested in what happens when you take a real person, a real experience, and you sort of like shift it 90 degrees or whatever in the work, and it's like its own thing, separate from life. People then project their own ideas onto. And I'm particularly interested in this because I have been, like I think I mentioned earlier, my husband's a painter. We've known each other since we were 20 years old. And I have appeared in a lot of his work. I'm often a model for him. And some of those pieces, there's this one painting in particular that he did of me when I was quite young. I was like maybe 21 or 22. He took this picture of me sitting in a tree, and I was quite depressed at the time. I was going through like this pretty major depressive episode, and he took this picture of me sitting in a tree, and later on he turned it into a painting. And that painting was in a show. The night of the opening, it sold to this oncologist, like a cancer doctor. He said, I'm going to put this painting in my waiting room. And his wife was there, and she was talking to me because she knew I was the model. And she said, I think this is such a beautiful painting. I'm so glad it's going in his, in his waiting room. No one can ever be sad looking at this painting. And inside I was thinking, oh my God, I was incredibly depressed. Like this is kind of like a cruel cosmic joke, like that that this person thinks like this is like a happy, beautiful painting, and actually like the joke's on you, the girl in that painting was like really depressed at the time. But that was like an interesting moment to me, because once somebody uses you in their work, you sort of become, it's not you anymore. It's an image or an idea or a character that other people project their own ideas onto. And that's really interesting to me. I really wanted to sort of explore that experience, what it's like to sort of see yourself not only refracted through somebody else's gaze and somebody else's interpretation. What happens when that interpretation goes out into the world and people project all kinds of other stuff onto it that you never intended and that the artist never intended?
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear that you yourself has been like the subject of a painting, and having that experience personally happen to you. That's really interesting. I mean, Karina in this novel and being the subject of Louisa's paintings, in terms of exploring the visual art as a medium in this book, and I can like picture those paintings while reading this, and I think that's a huge feat of your writing is to be able to really be able to like evoke these images, because I feel like for me personally, I have a hard time creating mental images in my head sometimes, and so I thought that was just fascinating that you could create this art through the novel form. I feel like that would be so difficult. So could you talk about how you write about paintings in this book generally?
Yeah, so that was also like, I should say that I am not a particularly visual thinker either. I have a terrible sense of direction. I can't really imagine objects in 3D. Like as an example, my husband is also, he's an artist and an architect, and oftentimes he'll show me drawings for buildings that he's working on, and they're just like, flat drawings, and I'll be like, that looks great. I don't really know what it looks like in my head because I really need to see like a 3D rendering. I can't imagine it. Anyway, When I started out writing this book, it was kind of a challenge to myself. I really wanted to set a novel at an art school because I thought it would be like a really narratively interesting environment. But I also I wanted to see if I could pull off writing about this very visual medium. And that took a lot of work because it didn't necessarily come naturally to me. And a lot of it involved just reading a lot of art criticism and sort of picking up tips and tricks from some of the writers that I found most compelling. But it also just, involved talking to artists, absorbing the way that they talked about their work, because the vocabulary that they use is, very different from the vocabulary that, fiction writers use to discuss their own work. So a lot of it, was just sort of, talking to my artist friends, talking to my artist partner, filing away like little notes and tidbits, particular words that they used for color, or for texture, or for line. I should say too that my husband's my first reader, always has been. I would show him passages, first drafts of passages involving particular works, and he would be able to help me with some of my descriptive language, but also just kind of my technical language. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that there's an author's note at the end of the book sort of citing some of the artists who inspired me, because many of these paintings I didn't, simply pull out of thin air. I was sort of using an existing art piece that I really loved as sort of a jumping off point to then create this new imaginary piece that I would then ascribe to a particular character.
One other thing too is you have an MFA. There's some scenes in this book that I love so much. I love when especially in campus novels when people are criticizing each other's art, and there's a lot of those scenes in which I forget what it's called, but it's just an open critique that the students have. Yeah.
Well, in writing MFAs, it's called a workshop.
Gotcha.
In visual arts, it's called a crit.
Did your workshop experience kind of play into those scenes in which everyone's talking very candidly about each other's work? I feel like that'd be so scary. I don't have an MFA, so I have no idea what that experience would be like, but it sounds rough.
My MFA was actually really great. I've heard horror stories from other people. I know some MFA programs have a reputation for being really cutthroat. Mine was not. Mine was very chill, very drama free, and very nice. I'm friends with my entire cohort. Like, we're still dear friends. We really support each other. I would say that I based it more off of my undergraduate experience in writing workshops, when I was like 19 or 20. Those were much rougher. I would, sometimes cry afterwards. I think in part because everybody in those workshops was younger and more insecure, still kind of developing as like fully formed people. Whereas, in grad school, we were all, in our, late 20s, 30s, some of us were in our 40s, and some people had children, people had kind of whole separate lives and had come into themselves a little bit more and didn't feel the need to like tear each other down. But I have also, as part of my research for this book, I sat in on art crits. Those can be very, very intense. I've witnessed people crying during crits. I've witnessed people leaving the room. I've witnessed like very tense, very, very tense arguments. Some of the stuff in the crit scenes, none of those crit scenes are based on any specific event that I witnessed. So a lot of it is just sort of little tidbits taken from real life and then sort of built up into an imaginary scene. But I certainly have witnessed in art crits people having such an emotional reaction to somebody's work that they start crying and leave the room. For some reason, I think that, visual arts crits are just very emotionally volatile spaces, which is not to say that writing workshops aren't. I think they can be. But most of my experience in writing workshops has been fairly tame.
I wonder if it's something to do with like the immediacy of seeing the object, like in kind of having an immediate response to it, rather than, I don't know, in a workshop setting, how is like the reading? Sorry, I'm getting way too into the weeds probably of MFA stuff, but I'm just curious, like how does a workshop differ, I guess, from an art crit in terms of like temporally when people like read the work?
Well, so generally in a writing workshop, you've handed out the piece like a week before it's being discussed, so everyone has sort of time to think about it, write up a reaction to it, and sometimes read it twice. That would often be my process. If I got, a piece from a classmate, I would read it once and then I would read it again with a pen in hand and mark it up. And so I had sort of time to think about my reaction to it, sometimes to change my mind about how I felt about certain things. Whereas I think there's an immediacy in a visual arts crit where you're seeing the piece for the first time on the wall and you have to react right then. So oftentimes what you're getting is people's just immediate gut reactions that have not been filtered through any kind of haven't had sort of time to percolate, and people haven't really had time to think about like, oh, is this actually what I want to say? Is there a better way to phrase this? What if I'm wrong? So yeah, so I think in part maybe the immediacy, and also just like the visual impact, maybe a piece that's really shocking or graphic can have on the viewer when they're not prepared for it.
Thinking about in the novel too, like I know I'm asking a lot of questions about the I want to say first half or so of when it's set at the school, but also the second half. The characters are sort of unleashed in New York and the differences between that for you, was it a challenge kind of moving outside of it, or was it easier to write the New York aspects of the novel? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that was a decision that I didn't come to immediately. When I first started writing the novel, envisioned it as the whole thing taking place on campus, just being like the characters being enclosed in this bubble over the course of the entire novel. Part of the reason, so I guess I should back up and say that I began writing this novel when I was quite young. I was just out of college. I was 23. Part of the impetus for writing a campus novel was that I really struggled with the transition to real life, in part because I was working as an elementary school teacher. So I went from being in this really vibrant, sort of intellectual, artistic environment to teaching little kids all day and not interacting with adults until I got home. And that was really hard for me. I felt very lonely. So part of when I began writing this novel, I was quite young, and I was in a way sort of trying to will myself back into this environment that had been in many ways very difficult for me, but also where I'd really felt myself come into my own as a person and as a writer. But as you and I have both mentioned, this novel took me a really long time to write, and by the time I got a little older, I sort of had settled into my new city. I'd made friends. I'd sort of begun enjoying my life as a postgraduate. I became kind of tired about writing about the insular college environment, and B, really interested in sort of exploring that transition from school to the real world. So I made this decision that I was going to have the second half of the book set in the New York art world. I chose New York obviously because it's sort of the center of the American art world, but I also my mother is from New York City. She grew up in Manhattan. We had very different childhoods. I grew up in rural Costa Rica. She grew up in Manhattan, and I grew up hearing about her stories of growing up in New York City. I perceived her childhood as like very exciting and very glamorous. So I had this sort of like idealized version of New York in my head growing up, and of course I've never lived there, but now of course I've spent a lot of time there. My sibling lived there until recently, and many of my close friends live there, and I've sort of got like my idealized version of New York kind of bumped up against the actual reality of living there, especially as a young person, as a creative person, and someone who doesn't have a lot of money. So I was sort of interested in exploring what it's like to sort of make that transition from school to the real world, and B, what it's like when your very idealized notions of a place kind of come face to face with reality and disintegrate.
Yeah, that's one thing I really loved about this book, was seeing that difference. I love novels that sort of use that kind of split of putting characters in one very distinct setting versus another, and kind of seeing what plays out for those characters given our assumptions or what we think we know about those characters, and how that kind of shifts by the end of it. And so I think the novel works really well in that regard. And myself, I'm 26 and I went to law school and I graduated 3 years ago, and so I've had similar questions or like musings about like, what am I doing, the kind of weird limbo feeling that you have post school. A lot to explore in a novel through that.
Yeah.
I think you do it well.
And I had there was this, when I was a senior in college, I had these little boys that I nannied, and I had a really close relationship with their mom. She knew I was about to graduate, and she said to me, it's like you go through a period of mourning. It's a lot, because you're never again going to live in this environment where everyone around you is your age and really, really interested in what they're pursuing, and sort of untethered in many ways from the demands of real life. And you're also losing a version of yourself. Like, you're never going to be that person again. And I think she was right. I think, I feel that I went through this period of mourning after school. And I think, my characters do too, even the ones who teach school and, are no longer in school themselves.
It's beautifully stated, and it's sad, yeah. One other question I wanted to ask you about in terms of your time at Brown. This is a self-indulgent question because I love Otessa Moshfegh, and it's my understanding that she was a teacher of yours at one point.
Yeah, Otessa's great. Yeah, so she was my teacher when I was an undergrad at Brown, and she was doing her MFA there. So I met her when I was 19. She was really my first writing teacher. And the first day of class, she talked about fear. I remember this very clearly. She talked about how when she was younger, she'd been afraid to be an artist. And I loved how honest she was. I felt really seen in that moment, as they say, because I was really afraid. I was 19. I'd always known that I wanted to write, but I was afraid. I was afraid of, I don't know, failing, I guess. And in that moment, I really needed someone, this young woman that I looked up to, but also sort of saw glimmers of myself in to give me permission. And so she was that person for me. And she was really encouraging in my work. I remember really wanting to impress her. I remember for my final project for that class, I wrote 4 linked short stories. And I remember she wrote that they were wonderful page-turning stories. And I'll always remember that. I was so elated. And she was really kind too. I was in this really bad roommate situation at the time, and it was really miserable. And so she wrote me an RA recommendation. I applied to be an RA, and she wrote me a recommendation so I could get out of that roommate situation and have a single. And then after we both left Brown, we kept in touch, and she wrote my letter of recommendation for grad school. And she was willing to answer my questions and give me advice and just be a mentor to me. And I think she's brilliant. She's someone I deeply, deeply admire. And I could, I really could tell from the first time I met her when I was 19 that, this was someone really, really special and really brilliant.
No, that's so cool to hear about your experience with her, and that's really interesting that she spoke about fear, because to me, like in my mind, through reading her books, she feels like such a fearless writer in my opinion, in terms of how she's very unafraid to explore the deepest, darkest parts of humanity. And that's really interesting hearing that experience and how that played out for you. So thank you for sharing that. I was just so curious to know like what she would be like in that sort of setting, I guess. So I guess last couple questions here. I've always asked for like book recommendations. So do you have like a recent read that you really loved in like the last year or so?
Yeah, so I have 2 recommendations that both just came out actually like 2 days ago, but I read them as arcs. So the first one is a memoir called Acceptance by Emmy Neatfeld. It's sort of hard to give an elevator pitch because it's such a complex memoir. It's ostensibly about going from being homeless in foster care to going to Harvard and working at Google. But what it's really about is sort of the myth of meritocracy and how these like society's obsession with like resilience narratives is really, really fucked up and harmful. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on
No, please do.
on your podcast. It's just an incredibly nuance about sort of the American obsession with individualism and overcoming, and how harmful that is for people who come from really traumatic backgrounds. It's also just like it's a really harrowing read, but it also manages to be incredibly funny. It's also like really queer, which I love. Emmy's bi, and she writes really, really beautifully about the experience of growing up bisexual, and what it means as a bi woman to end up with a man, and end up with sort of being like an invisible queer person, which is how I often feel. So anyway, that's one recommendation. Another book that also just came out that I read as an arc is All This Could Be Different by Sarah Thunkam Matthews. This is a novel, also takes place during the Obama years, during the recession. It's a coming of age story about a queer Indian immigrant in Milwaukee, and it's about friendship and work, precarity, and it's just sort of this like warm, all-encompassing novel. It's the kind of novel that you just want to live in forever and never leave. There's this older book that I always recommend to people because I think more people should know about, Sarah Shunlian Bynum. She writes short stories. She just came out, I think, last year with a book of short stories called Likes. But she has this really fantastic novel called Miss Hempel Chronicles. It's about a teacher. It's about a middle school teacher. And it's one of my favorite novels. Not enough people know about it. And I've just been rereading it recently because I used to be a teacher. I taught elementary school, and my next novel is about a teacher. And I feel like there's, not enough representation of elementary school teaching and how weird it is to just be around little kids all day. So that's another book that I always recommend. Miss Hempel Chronicles by Sarah Shunlian Bynum.
I have Likes on my TBR. I've been meaning to read it for like the last year and a half, I want to say. But I just picked up, I knew it was over here, All This Could Be Different,
Yeah.
on Pub Day, because I saw some really awesome buzz. So I'm excited now that you gave the recommendation too.
It's really fantastic. And I love the cover too. It's a Nicole Eisenman painting.
It's gorgeous. Yeah.
Mhm.
I also have Acceptance. It's not next to me, but I'm really excited for both of those. So thank you. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and these really awesome responses. I really love this discussion, and I'm always just so appreciative of writers coming on. And this is like my favorite thing to do right now. So just thank you so much. I really
Thank
appreciate it.
you so much. This was such a wonderful discussion. You asked like such smart questions. I'm really, really grateful.
Thank you so much. And everyone watching, by the way, I will leave a link below to purchase the book. Thank you so much. I love this book so much, and I can't wait to see more readers' responses to it. And I think it's going to be a huge hit generally. So I'm
Thank
excited.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.